Chapter 4. Buck was as alarmed as anyone at the increase in war around the globe, and a seemingly corresponding escalation of natural disasters. The months since the attempted Russian invasion of Israel had seen records set in the United States for tornadoes, earthquakes, hurricanes, and forest fires. President Gerald Fitzhugh had declared so many disaster areas that the novelty seemed to wear off. Charities began advertising aggressively, competing for funds, claiming some sites were worse off than others, when the truth was that any locale slammed by some force of nature had been left destitute. And war. South America reeled under revolutions in several nations at once. The U.S. announced newer, tougher sanctions on Cuba for human rights violations, and a new Cold War settled over U.S.-Russian relations. Northern Ireland had erupted again. The Arab-Israeli conflict reached new heights. North Korea threatened her entire hemisphere. Every day brought more devastating news of conflict and disaster, and even Buck had to agree that there seemed to be almost a palpable hum in the air. He had to draw comfort from daily emails to and from Lucinda Washington. "Nobody in New York is interested in my take on this," she transmitted one morning. "But you know we're headed towards something, Cameron. Things can't just keep getting worse without something having to give." How could he argue with that? Doomsdayers predicted the end of the world as he knew it. But what did that mean? The whole place blows up? A pandemic takes more than half the lives on the planet. World War III breaks out. What? Buck actually found himself curious to know what his sister-in-law thought about what was going on. Sharon was the religious one in the family, nearly alienating her husband, Buck's brother Jeff, and his dad in the process. But the invitations to come home had ended with his mother's death. Buck did not feel wanted. And while he knew Sharon would happily engage in the very conversation that intrigued him, he knew better than to seek real story content from relatives. Countless experts abounded on both sides of the issue of the future and where society was headed. Thing was, he was not being assigned stories on that subject. His beat was hard international news, geopolitical stuff. He would leave the other to the religion editor, personally intriguing as it might be. Leon Fortunato was struck that Romanian President Georg Vasili appeared to be an older copy of himself. They were of the same blocky height and build, though the president was much more jowly and his hair was gray. In his late 60s, Vasili was a humorless politico in private, gregarious and smiling in public. He had told the people he had one more term in his old body, and early polls showed him a huge favorite over several potential candidates. But the polls did not reflect any public opinion over how he would fare against the much younger Nicolae Carpathia. No one had ever reached the presidency directly from the lower house. However, everyone was, of course, familiar with the charismatic peacenik who had proved so eloquent and articulate, endearing himself to fellow party members and ingratiating himself with the opposition. Vasili seemed bemused as he read Leon's card. "I am meeting with you, Mr. Fortunato, not because I have time or interest, but because Mr. Carpathia begged my indulgence. And you serve him as chief of staff?" "I serve him in many roles," Leon said, earnestness oozing from every pore. "But yes, in his role as a member of the House, I am his chief of staff." President Vasili had come out from around his enormous ebony desk that appeared as if it had grown where it stood and had rested there for centuries. He sat across from Fortunato at a small round table, the shape a recurring motif of the men themselves. "I was unaware that members of the lower house had equipi, let alone chiefs of the same." Fortunato smiled, trying to soften the bite of his words. "You well know that Dr. Carpathia is much more than a politician. Indeed, his influence is wide and varied." "Dr. Carpathia? Oh yes, the adjunct professorships. I am quite aware of the Flacau's outside interest and influence." "He is anything but a lad, Mr. President, despite his youth." "So you say." Have you ever experienced Dr. Carpathia's opposition in one of your initiatives? Fortunato, writing on his small notepad all the while, clearly piqued Vasilei's interest. Of course I have. What do you mean? He has spoken often and loudly in opposition to our defense initiatives, despite his connections with the military schools, his associations with them, and then his insipid pandering to the public with his peace-mongering make garish his aim to unseat me someday. Someday, Fortunato said dismissively, still writing. By now, Vasilei was leaning to see what he had written. But when Fortunato finished, he turned the paper upright and slid it across to the president. Are you aware that Carpathia is a partner of Jonathan Stonegal's? He has been aware of and signed off on every transaction. Every transaction, it read. Fortunato fought to suppress a grin, while Vasilei blanched and cleared his throat. The older man checked his watch, stood, and buttoned his suit coat. What is your schedule like, Mr. Fortunato? I would like to treat you to my favorite Baturu Alcoholica. Fortunato, resolutely ignoring protocol by remaining seated, though the president was standing, said, I'm not big on liquor, sir, but I will sample a taste if you insist. I assume, if it is your favorite, that you have a selection here. Vasilei glared at him. I have a special place I like to go. Oh, I'm fine right here, Leon said, which caused Vasilei to grab his pen and scribble on the paper. Installate Electrica, private. Fortunato had known, of course, that the wiring of the presidential offices was bugged, and that any serious discussion of this nature would have to take place elsewhere. Very well, he said, rising and donning his overcoat. Vasilei told his secretary to cancel his appointments and have the Securitat bring a car around and reserve a table at Caruta's. He added that he would want to be left alone with Fortunato, which Leon took to mean that the Securitat would remain close, but not close enough to listen in. Interesting choice, the wagoner. Leon, who had lied about his impartiality toward liquor, knew the place well. It was a hole in the wall, less than 2 miles from the capital, and the patrons had been trained to leave the president to his cups, should they see him there. Leon loved the pomp and circumstance that surrounded a brief jaunt by car with the president. Citizens milled about on the street, hoping for such an occurrence, and a glimpse of the man they had seen on state television for years. When they crowded the vehicle, the secret police held them back, and soon Vasilei and Fortunato were on their way to the Cafenek. Knowing it would take a moment for the Securitat to get the president from the vehicle to his favorite booth, Leon leaped out as soon as they stopped and rushed in, asking the manager if he was aware of Vasilei's coming. Of course, we are prepared. I will be joining him, Leon said, pressing a large bill in the man's palm. What is the president's favorite drink? A Russian vodka. Clear? Yes. Make mine a water regardless of what I say. Comprende? I understand. Within minutes, Fortunato and Vasilei were jammed into tiny quarters, and the public was kept away, though passers-by stared. When the vodka was brought to the table, along with 2 glasses, Fortunato panicked. Scusa, he whispered, waving for the manager. A head of a state should not be expected to pour his own drinks. Nonsense, Georg Vasilei said. But Fortunato insisted, and the manager, bowing and apologizing, took the bottle and glasses away, then returned with the glasses full. He winked at Fortunato, and Leon was grateful to discover that his was water. The impudence, Leon whispered. They know me here. I often pour for myself. You should not, never. You preside over this country. That is due some deference. But in here, in the bar, I'm just a man. May it never be so. Leon could tell he was making an impression on the man. He wondered if Vasilei's chief of staff ever treated him this way. He did not know a leader whose ego did not crave such regard. When Fortunato opened his mouth to speak, Vasilei held up a hand for silence as he downed 1 glass and held it up for another pour. Leon waved for the manager, who handled the task. Leon had barely sipped his water. Excellent. Huh? You see, this is how you should be treated. I see. Vasily knocked back the second glass and set it down loudly. Another? Later. Talk to me. What are you saying? Fortunato had long loved the directness of the powerful. They did not have the time for pleasantries and small talk, and that, naturally, was not what Leon was here for anyway. I am saying that your fortune, the one the public believes is appropriately tied up in a trust during the tenure of your presidency, is being managed not only by Jonathan Stonegal, but also Nikolai Karpatia. Vasily stared, glowering. And what are the ramifications of this? Ramifications? You need ask. Surely you would not expect the Romanian people to believe your presidential salary alone finances your wife's annual stipend. Your son's palatial estate that people think is funded by his lucrative stallion breeding operation, but which you and I both know is a house of cards. Your own storehouses of precious metals, American stocks and bonds, Asian securities, European land holdings. Were word to get out that you, sir, fund all of this with income wholly criminally gained, why, it would all be in jeopardy. Vasily squinted and leaned forward. Karpatia is aware of all this? How do you think I know? And he is not also vulnerable, if he has such information and has not reported it. Fortunato sat back, still speaking softly. No one can determine when this information came to him, but you well know that knowledge is a power. He has both. He has no wish to humbly, reluctantly, sadly come forward and announce his abject disappointment in a worthy opponent he has long admired, despite political disagreements. But he would he not? Of course he would. Fortunato was warm in the smoky, crowded place, and he wriggled out of his overcoat. The president, flushed and sweaty, not only left his on, but also left it buttoned to his neck. He folded his arms and lowered his chin, appearing sad. He stared at Leon, and then at the table. So, this is stoacre. It is indeed extortion, Mr. President. Vasily rested his elbows on the table and pressed his palms against his generous cheeks. He sighed, inhaled as if to speak, then appeared to rethink himself. Finally, in a hoarse whisper, he said, I suppose you are prepared to tell me what the man wants. Of course I am.